Murray Watt joins me, Labor's Emergency Services spokesman. Murray Watt, thanks for your time. You're ahead in the polls.
G'day, Andrew.
Can you lose from here?
Well, we're not taking anything for granted, and yeah, we're not taking anything for granted, Andrew. This is a very close race. The polls have changed up and down over the course of this term, and they may change again between now and polling day. But I mean, I think it's pretty clear that there has been a shift towards Labor over the last few days. Anthony Albanese has been performing very strongly, very confidently in his daily press conferences, whereas Scott Morrison is just flailing around, throwing punches in every direction like some punch-drunk boxer. So I think, it's going to be close. There's a number of seats that are neck and neck, and I don't think anyone will know the result until pretty late on Saturday night.
Well, I ran some industry polling this morning that had a very tight race in Hunter. Are you worried about Hunter and Gilmore and a couple of other seats that the government can win to offset losses?
Well, we've always known that some of those seats in New South Wales would be close run, just as they are in Queensland and every other state. But everything I'm hearing is that we've been running a really strong campaign in those seats. I've spent time campaigning in Gilmore myself, and it's pretty clear to me there that Fiona Phillips has established a really strong reputation, particularly around bushfire recovery, standing with her community when Scott Morrison was completely missing in action. So I'm pretty confident that in the end we'll get there in those seats, and in fact that we'll hold every seat around the country. But of course, many of them are going to be close, and we're going to have to fight for every single vote in every seat.
Now, you're a Queenslander. Unquestionably, it's different voting-wise to the rest of the nation. All the polls show that. And anecdotally, you hear it too, that Labor are likely to stay well behind here. The coalition has 23 of 30 seats. You'll be lucky to win one or two. Why is that? Why does Queensland have a different attitude towards federal Labor than the rest of the country?
Yeah, well, I mean, Queensland has always traditionally been a fairly conservative state when it comes to federal elections, and I mean that both in terms of conservative with a capital C voting for the Conservative parties, but also people often taking a bit of time to make up their minds about making a change. But as I say, I've been across a number of seats just in the last week, let alone before that in Queensland, and everywhere I've gone, you can definitely feel that there is a mood for change. And I think that's because people have had a gutful of this Prime Minister across Queensland, and this laughable idea that he thinks that he can change.
OK, we'll get to that. But it sounds like from what you're saying, you're expecting a majority government for Labor on Saturday night.
Well, again, I wouldn't want to be sounding too cocky or confident because, of course, polls got it wrong last time. Things can change, but we're certainly aiming for a majority Labor government, and based on everything I'm seeing and hearing around Queensland and around the country, I think we can get there. But we're going to have to work incredibly hard for every seat, every vote. There are so many people who have not made up their minds yet, and we need to earn their trust over the next week. But based on everything I've been seeing over the last week and the respective leaders' performances, I think that I'm confident that we can gain the trust of enough Australians to form a healthy majority.
Now, you've been a big Anthony Albanese backer. Obviously, he's made a few gaffes during the campaign. There are question marks about his performance out of that. Should we have any concerns about what sort of job he would do as Prime Minister, whether he's up to it?
No, we don't. And, I've never had those concerns, and that's why I've always supported him as our leader. And more importantly, I think what we're seeing is that Australians support him as well. It was really interesting going back to your first debate between the leaders and the audience questions. It was after a week of these so-called gaffes, and not one question from the audience members, average voters, was about that sort of thing. What people are doing, I think, is responding really positively to the plans that Anthony Albanese and Labor are putting forward. People out there are experiencing real problems, whether it be their cost of living, their job not being secure, concerns about us not making things in Australia again, and they're exactly the issues that Labor is addressing through our policies. So I'm not concerned about Anthony Albanese's performance. I think he'd be a terrific Prime Minister in the Bob Hawke model, and I think over time what we're seeing is that Australians are coming to that view as well.
Right, what's your reaction to the Coalition's housing policy announcement this morning?
Well, as Albo has said, when there's a good idea, we'll support it, and we'll support this one. We think this is a good idea worth taking on. But the reality is that just one announcement from this government after nearly a decade in office is not going to fix the housing crisis that we see in Australia. It's a real shame that it's taken nearly a decade in office before this government is starting to put forward policies like this to address the housing shortages and housing affordability crisis that we have. And that's why Labor is going to this election not just committing to do this thing that the government has announced today, but with a much more comprehensive plan around building homes through our Housing Australia Fund, 30,000 more social and affordable homes over the next 5 years, along with our Help to Buy scheme, the guarantee available for regional first home buyers. This is going to take a range of measures to address this, because it's obviously become one of the #1 issues facing people both in our cities and our regions. So sure, we'll support this idea, but we've got a lot more on the table to address housing prices and shortages as well.
Labor has its own advanced manufacturing policy today. Feels like we sort of heard all this before: manufacturing grants, reconstruction funds. I think Scott Morrison's announced a $1 billion manufacturing fund before. Why is this different? Why will this make a difference?
Well, I'm glad that you've heard this before, these sorts of things before, Andrew, because it shows that we're talking about the right things that people care about. But today's announcement is something new. We have obviously previously announced a $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund, which is all about rebuilding manufacturing in this country. A lot of people don't realise this, but over the life of this government, over nearly a decade in office, we've lost about 85,000 manufacturing jobs in Australia, and our position as a manufacturing nation has slipped against the rest of the world. So it's no surprise that through COVID we were caught short, supply chains fell down, we didn't have the manufacturing capacity ourselves in Australia, and what this announcement today is about is making sure that we can stand on our own 2 feet as a country. COVID has shown us that we've got to become more self-reliant, we've got to have a sovereign manufacturing capability, and today's announcement will do that. So it's another addition to what we have announced in the Broad.
Murray Watt, we're almost out of time. Just a few other things I wanted to ask you about. We saw this announcement by Peter Dutton on Friday about a Chinese spy ship. What's your reaction to that?
Well, we have always said that we share concerns expressed by the government about the behaviour of China. This is a concerning statement from Peter Dutton. We've had a very preliminary briefing from the government, but we are seeking something in more detail just to basically understand the facts of the situation. So, you know, as I say, we're concerned about these sorts of issues, and we'll always stand up for Australia's national security.
OK. Scott Morrison says he can change, says he might have appeared unempathetic because he was in problem-solving mode during the pandemic. What do you think of that? Isn't that fair enough?
I just think it's laughable, and I think most Australians think it's laughable. I mean, this guy just says whatever comes out of his mouth, whatever he thinks he needs to do to win a vote. I mean, a couple of days ago he was a bulldozer. Today he's a car. By the end of the afternoon he'll probably be a Vespa. I mean, this guy is the incredible shrinking Prime Minister. And I think the reason for it is that he knows Australians have woken up to him. This guy cannot change.
Okay.
He has promised over and over again to change.
All right. On the inflation, surely Anthony Albanese didn't mean to push for 5%. Won't this push up inflation?
No, we don't think it will, and more importantly, a number of highly respected economists have already come out saying that a lift to the minimum wage won't do that. I mean, this has become a real contrast between what Labor is offering going into this election and what the government is. You've got Labor on the one hand saying that people's wages should rise, and you've got the government saying that their policy of keeping wages low as a deliberate design feature will persist into the next 3 years. If Australians want to see pay rises, they've got to change the government. You know, it's one thing for Scott Morrison to say that he can change or that he's going to go and get himself some empathy training. People are born that way. Lack of empathy is in Scott Morrison's DNA. He has not changed once, whether it be the bushfires, the vaccines, the rats, the floods. The same behaviour comes through, not taking responsibility, blaming other people, always having excuses rather than taking charge. And I don't think that Australians can afford the risk of that kind of behaviour going for another 3 years.
All right, now you're pushing the risk line. Is there anything you're in a hurry to do in your portfolio if elected, emergency management, around the flood response around Lismore, for example? What would be some of your first acts?
Yeah, and as you can see, Andrew, being in Brisbane, we're experiencing flooding again in some parts of southeast Queensland again, in some places for the third or fourth time this year, in addition to the disaster that we saw down in Lismore and the Northern Rivers. I've obviously spent a fair bit of time in that region trying to understand what people need. I think there's a desperate need for some sort of medium-term housing solutions for people. We've got to get grants rolling out the door much more quickly than they are at the moment. And of course, Labor's key commitment in disaster management heading into the election is a serious investment by the federal government in disaster mitigation. I think you and I have talked before about that ridiculous emergency response fund the government has got, which is nearly $5 billion sitting in it, earning over $800 million in interest for the government, but not having built a single disaster mitigation project in 3 years. So that's why we want to convert that into being a disaster-ready fund that invests up to $200 million a year in flood levies, drainage improvements, bushfire evacuation centres, those kinds of things that we need around Australia to keep people safe and keep their properties safe. So that would be a big distinction and something that I'd be in a real hurry to get up and running if we're fortunate enough to be elected.
Murray Watt, thanks for your time.